Hey guys, this is another update. This will be a review of chapter 24. We're talking about the 1920s. The 1920s were a time of rapid economic expansion in the United States, but it was also a time of excess. So I'm going to go ahead and break down the sections one by one. The first section is mass culture, materialism, marketing, and morals. In the 1920s in the United States, this is a time of ultra-optimism. The United States had grown stronger after World War I, where Europe had destroyed itself. Now, standards of living in the United States are going to continue to rise thanks to things like technology, changes in the government that came from progressivism. Workers are paid more by the 20s, worked less as well. Even though new machines were replacing workers, because of the rapid growth of the American service economy, the labor market grew faster than the population. There were always jobs available, even though technology was removing some jobs. And if you don't understand what that means, technology, nowadays it would be robotics or artificial intelligence. Certain new machinery, new technology in factories might make a human unnecessary. So the amount of consumer goods bought and sold during this time will skyrocket. Consumer culture is really going to take off. The concept that regular people expect it to be treated like royalty by companies, that's going to begin during this time. So, the customer is always right, that type of attitude. I remember before we talked about department stores wouldn't even let you in unless it was very obvious that you could afford to buy something. So window shopping literally meant window shopping because you were outside. But during this time, since the standard of living increased so much, a normal person almost always had enough money to buy things from a department store. So again, businesses' attitudes towards the average person will change. They don't see the average person as a nuisance. They see the average person now as a potential consumer. And so the United States in the 1920s saw one of the best standards of living of all time for any civilization, like in human history. A lot of times, even in the South, if you see an ornate marble structure, something with gargoyles or, detailed stonework, typically it was built in the 20s. Okay, so of course with all this positivity, I have to bring it down and be negative. The next section is the unseen dangers. Now, in this mood of extreme optimism, people, for the most part, forgot what bad times were like. You're going to have people lose interest in preparing for unexpected hardship. You're going to have people, and this just always happens, start to believe that, an economic depression is not something that could ever happen again. Almost as if we solved that problem. We don't have to worry about it. With this Federal Reserve that saw its role as pumping up the economy even more, even when things were going well. When it came to consumer confidence, when it came to how businesses advertise to people, basically the attitude was things are going to go up always and always. And so people spent all of their money as if things were only going to get better. So the idea of saving money was seen as maybe old-fashioned or inefficient. Why keep your money under your mattress when you could invest your money in the stock market and make a much better return? That we're talking about an extended period of prosperity and growth. It looked like, hey, let's all just pour our money into consuming things, and when I say consuming, I don't mean just food. I mean, buying non-essential items. And of course, the definition of essential changes as standard of living increases. What is considered essential grows with it, so that people are spending nearly all of their money. Because of the rapid increase in national prosperity, credit expanded and people made purchases without having to make down payments. That's going to cause personal debt, like credit cards. Personal debt began to rise faster than pay increases. Now, consumption did lead to growth because, as we've talked about, our economy is based on ever increasing consumption. And then if consumption stops, then it's more than just, the economy starts to shrink a little bit. It can cause a chain reaction. So consumption will lead to growth, but little did everybody realize this fever for consumption and piling up consumer debt, it's going to lead to serious problems down the road, especially if you consider the Federal Reserve's role in been trying to turbocharge natural growth. We won't get into too many details on that unless I have questions. I can follow up later. All right, now let's talk about another big reason for growth during this era, the automobile. Now, like most new inventions, early on, the automobile was something that only rich people owned. The earliest automobiles weren't used for your day-to-day transportation to work. They were used as like leisure. Similar to drones, you know, when you think about it, when drones first came out, people would just play with them and like, oh, this is a neat thing. And then there started to be practical applications of, but cars were just seen as, you know, go for a weekend drive. By 1920, 10 million cars had been purchased, and that was a lot, and that's going to revolutionize American travel. Now, by 1929, just to give you some scale here, 1 in 5 Americans owned a car. Compare that to Britain at the same time, 1 in 43 people in Britain owned a car. So the car, especially very early on, was really an American thing, and it had a tremendous impact on the American economy, but also on American culture. The growth of the automobile was a huge part of the constantly expanding American economy. A car relied on several other industries, and it's going to cause those industries to grow. So, you know, steel, aluminum, rubber, asphalt, you know, all the things that go into making roads, construction, mechanics, like garages, oil, glass, all the other things. Another huge thing that causes it to grow is that, and we're going to talk about Henry Ford, but once the car becomes affordable for the average person, then it's going to change American society and the economy even more. If you guys remember in the previous section, I just said that as a standard of living continues to grow, as people make more money and they have more time, with consumerism and mass consumption, people tend to just expand the definition of what's necessary, what's essential. And so, obviously, before cars existed, nobody thought a car was essential. But now cars have, for most people, have been added to the essential category. And yes, we have public transportation, but the vast majority of people don't use it. They don't want to use it in the United States. The automobile is not only an example of, you know, a new invention that unleashes more freedom of travel and things like that. It's a huge example of, as Americans have more money to afford something new, they can add something huge like, well, the automobile to it. That's important to keep in mind because people tend to get the idea, if you don't have historical context and you don't realize what was normal for people 100 years ago or 150 years ago or 200 years ago, and you get stuck in just what you're used to, you can take a lot for granted. But historically speaking, you can sort of lose touch with what is essential and what isn't. Now, I'm not trying to make an argument that cars aren't essential. I know that our economy is different and transportation to the job and all that. But when people make more money, they find something else to say is essential. So, I mean, if you think about the amount of money people spend on phones nowadays, you know, people used to have maybe a $20 phone bill or a $30 phone bill, and now people have $80, $100 phone bills, $60 phone bills, and phones cost $700 now instead of, you know, $40 or less. It's not that Americans made a conscious choice to stop doing something else and replace it with phones. It's that as Americans have the ability to afford more luxury, they add something else that's considered essential. If you think about why that happens, we're going to talk about marketing. Marketing is a big reason why. There's a reason that billions and billions of dollars every year are spent on trying to convince people to buy things. I mean, if it was that obvious what people needed to buy, you wouldn't need advertisements. But advertisements aren't about trying to convince people to buy what they absolutely have to have. It's trying to convince people to buy things they might not need, for the most part. So Henry Ford, the man mostly responsible for making the automobile industry open to a much larger percentage of Americans, the innovations of his company drastically reduced the cost of producing cars. So it's not that he invented a new car. He was already making cars. I mean, he did invent a new car at one point, but the big revolution was actually by changing the way cars were produced in order to bring the price down. So again, more people could afford it. So in 1914, Ford introduced the automobile assembly line. The people that he hired learned about the assembly line from other industries like the meatpacking industry and applied it to making cars. And that and some other developments enabled Ford to chop the price of the famous Model T from $845 to $290. So not only did Ford revolutionize the automobile industry, but he dramatically changed American society as a result. So if you think about it, by making cars cheaper, the Ford company made it possible for millions of Americans to travel faster and farther than at any time in human history. And, there's psychological aspects to that as well. If you think about how it may impact the psyche or a person's view of themselves if they know that they could choose to drive hundreds of miles away on their own at any point. You may not choose to do it all the time, but knowing you feel a little bit differently. Because, the vast majority of human beings born on this planet for most of human history were born and died within 20 miles of the same place or less. So the fact that you can every weekend drive 100 miles, if you choose to, that has a big impact on the way Americans see themselves. And then more obvious impacts, this is going to lead to an increase in fast food. If people are on the go, if more people are doing long distance travel, if people have the ability to pull over when they want, fast food, drive-ins, convenience stores attached to like gas stations, diners, all those things are going to pop up and become important in American society. Now, also, Henry Ford, in terms of his attitude towards the economy and society, he preached paying higher wages. Ford argued that if you paid workers enough to afford more consumer goods, then all businesses and the economy would be better off. And he figured out that, in a consumption-based economy, the money that people get, if it's not being saved, if people aren't investing it in, their own self-sufficiency, they're just going to give it back to companies anyway. So the more you pay them, the more money you're recycling. And since buying things is the linchpin of the American economy, the more you pay. If people are going to spend it, then, the faster the economy will grow. And so Ford paid double what other companies were paying, unskilled labor. And he's also going to shorten the work week to 5 days and 40 hours, which eventually became, standard. Now, there's another side to working for Ford. I'm not going to get into too many details. I mentioned this in lecture. He would literally spy, or he would hire people to spy on his employees. He would get very involved in their domestic lives. They would have to work very hard, and the work was always monotonous, but it was demeaning and very unnatural. You have to do one very specific thing for a long period of time, and then so you would just get paid a lot more. And so part of the paying people a lot more, it certainly wasn't all just altruism. It was, a lot of it was, yes, we'll get most of the money back because they're going to be consumers, but also it'll convince them to work here even though it's hell. Okay, so prosperity and big business, that's the next section. Now, because consumption, mass consumption, was the wave that the American economy rode on during the 20s, much of the nation's wealth was controlled by business. Because people were distracted by their increased standard of living, because that was going up, there was no longer a popular demand for regulating big business quite as much. So you're going to see a lot of regulations, taxes are going to go down. There still will be regulation, and the federal government will still be very powerful. The 1920s is also going to see a round of mergers that created several massive companies. And these companies are going to use like advanced methods of quote-unquote scientific management to efficiently reinvest profits and also convince consumers to spend more. So even though workers' wages did increase, the money quickly ended up back in the hands of the big businesses. People traded in their wealth for stuff at a very high rate. And again, since debt was tied to much of this stuff, society was vulnerable to economic hardship. So it was one of those situations where, if you understand the concept of being leveraged, so if you owe a lot of money, if there are things that you have not yet paid for, you're leveraged. So if something bad happens, like there is an economic disaster or something unexpected, like a coronavirus, if you're not leveraged, you're not in a lot of debt, or you have even maybe savings, then you're much more resilient. You can hang on. But if you spend almost everything, you're leveraged, you owe a lot of money, you have a lot of stuff, then you're very vulnerable. And so as a whole, with all the, I hate to be down on optimism, but with all the optimism, the naive belief that things are always going to just continue to get better, the United States as a whole, not everyone, obviously there's exceptions to everything, was very leveraged and vulnerable to something bad happening. vulnerable to the shock like it is now. All right, let's talk about the conversion to consumer culture. Now, when big business and American industry kicked off in the later 1800s, when people thought about prosperity, it was tied to things like the railroad and other large business projects. So, in other words, at the beginning of industrialization, big businesses, what they were interested in was other big business projects. So one business would be selling something to another business, like the railroad, the quintessential example. And so all I'm trying to do is establish that it wasn't until later that businesses turned to the American consumer as the most important way to make money. Again, because for a long time, the average American consumer couldn't afford to buy a lot of stuff. So now that workers had more time, more money, and this infrastructure had been laid down that connected the country, it made it easier for companies to reach consumers. The economy began to depend on consumption. In other words, as long as everybody kept buying stuff, the economy grew. So an increasing percentage of American companies turned to producing consumer goods. Now, when companies need people to buy their product in order for that company to succeed, what do companies do about it? They advertise. So the next section is the growth of advertising. Now, companies decided in the 1920s to stop focusing on the products themselves and instead appeal to abstract desires of the consumer. A company would say, we could explain to people why our product is awesome. We could give them specifics or details. But what companies are going to find is that for whatever reason about most people and human nature, is that it's more effective to appeal to abstract emotional concepts to convince people to buy things. I've always had a hard time understanding that because that is so far away from how I am, but apparently it works. The data makes it pretty clear. So when we talk about appealing to abstract desires, we're talking about like health, social status, being popular, vanity, fear, whatever. And World War I and the propaganda associated with World War I was a great source of lessons on how to convince people to do something. During World War I, the power of propaganda was witnessed, as many people were convinced to support the war effort by it, or maybe convinced to buy war bonds. Advertisement strategists aimed at emotions and determined, and here's a quote, the average normal American had a literate capacity of a 12 or 14-year-old, end quote. So that just goes to show you sort of the attitude. Here's who we're targeting. We have to speak their language, dumb it down. Now, behavioral psychologists, they're going to be hired by large corporations to help manipulate consumers even more. And so, you can think about advertisements now. I've been doing this for about 10 years. I pick on different advertisements, the ones that are the most egregious examples of abstract, nothing to do with the product. And the one that annoys me the most right now is Mazda. Their tagline is "Feel Alive," which, I don't know, I tend to think it implies that if you buy another type of car, maybe you'll feel a little bit closer to death or dead, I'm not sure. But it doesn't talk about the car really at all. It just shows pictures of the car, sounds of the car accelerating, and then there are literally pictures, or I guess scenes, where there's a woman floating on a balloon, like over a mountain, and like descending. It looks like she's descending into heaven. Or I say descending into heaven. Well, she's descending in the video, and it looks like heaven is where she's going. So in the video, she's descending into heaven, but I do realize the irony of saying that. Anyway, moving on. There, infomercials, you've seen them before, where maybe there's like a new type of toothbrush that's better for sensitive teeth, so that there's this actor in the commercial, and they like jab their face with the toothbrush, and then they go like, ah! And then there's like a red X about like, don't hurt yourself, buy this thing. Which of course they're not saying it, but it's like, hey, look, you're a total invalid. You cannot handle normal life. Pay us, we'll give you this, and then you can continue to be an idiot and it won't hurt you in the mouth. Or, like with cars. Think about cars. So cars cost much more to make now, even considering inflation and all that. And they're putting all this new technology in there. So now a car is like a rolling computer. The cars have had computers for a while, but now, remote, keyless starting, all this other stuff. It's not necessarily essential, but, people like it. And they put it in their standard now, and it costs more. So people, when they buy a car, they're actually spending more. And part of the reason they have to do that is cars are more reliable across the board. And when I say reliable, I'm talking about, the powertrain. So if cars last longer, that's not necessarily good for the car companies because they don't get to sell as many cars. If their cars died automatically every 3 or 4 years, which is what, Apple tries to intentionally do to its phone batteries, or used to. Who knows if they're still doing it. But then, you will buy more. So car companies have to find a way to convince people that, hey, you don't need a new car, but you should want a new car, and we'll sell it to you. And with financing, we'll make it easy. Don't worry about if you can afford it. We'll make you think you can afford it. And then you can just figure it out later once you've bought it. As a result of all this, consumer debt will go up. We have the start of radio stations, movies, the expansion of widely circulated newspapers. All of this is going to quicken the pace of mass culture. And when I say mass culture, more people were being exposed to the same thing over a larger distance than ever before. So with the spread of mass culture came, obsession with celebrities. People had more access to national heroes, like maybe a sports star, movie star. With more free time, some people chose to spend it on finding out more about the personal lives of famous people. Hard to relate, but that's a thing. The next section is rejecting the status quo. Obviously, most people get swept up in whatever's normal, but there are those who are like curmudgeons, like me, and their first instinct is to be critical or to think about, maybe negatively, about what's going on. What are these changes good? So at least question what's going on. And so while the 1920s were an optimistic time for many, there were a growing number of poets, artists, writers that were unhappy, some disgusted by what they saw. Now, after World War I, many people saw that the advanced European civilization that was supposed to have set up this new era of utopia on Earth basically had destroyed itself for no good reason. And many writers like T.S. Eliot, Sinclair Lewis, Ernest Hemingway, he was The Sun Also Rises, Old Man in the Sea, F. Scott Fitzgerald, wrote The Great Gatsby. These guys saw American society as increasingly distracted by materialism and hollow. And materialism, again, very important concept. We've talked about it in class already, but it's not just the most obvious example of someone who's obsessed with their material possessions. Materialism is a widespread social reality that people define their life goals through what they own. Again, even if a person doesn't consider themselves status obsessed or they consider themselves relatively humble, you're necessarily materialistic if you live in our society. Whether it's a car, again, it could be functional materialism. It doesn't have to be just vanity materialism. But owning stuff is the basis of success. Owning stuff is the basis of how well you're doing. And so again, a lot of these guys saw materialism as an ugly thing. They saw people's values as becoming hollow. Faith in progress and faith in human reason. To a lot of these guys, it was faith in a lie. There was no progress. It was just more stuff. And that wasn't the only thing that mattered. Read all their stuff. Another thing that's happening during this time, if you guys remember, we covered the Great Migration when African Americans were able to, about 400,000, leave the South, pursue opportunities elsewhere that were created by World War I and a lot of white males leaving the workforce. So one thing that's going to come out of this is called the New Negro Movement. And so after the Great Migration, there were many new and larger communities of blacks in the North. The most important by far in the early 20th century was Harlem. Harlem was the site of a flowering of black culture, black artistic expression. Now, like a lot of other movements that we talk about, it can be, once you give something a name, you sort of make it seem as if it was one thing. And that may sound weird, but what I'm trying to say is there are lots of different political perspectives associated with the New Negro Movement, ranging from integration to keeping races separate. But one overriding theme was a defiant pride in all things considered African American. The NAACP, which it was founded in 1910, But during this new Negro movement, the NAACP was a huge promoter of black civil liberties, social equality. Obviously, they fell very short of their goals because of the obvious pushback in the United States. But the NAACP, they're going to push for the removal of Jim Crow laws. They're going to try to get an anti-lynching bill passed in 1922. It did not pass because of the filibuster by Southern senators. And I remember we covered filibuster in class. You hopefully remember what that is. Either way, pressure by the NAACP, pressure by other thought leaders in the new Negro movement, it did contribute to at least moving the ball down the field. Certainly nowhere close to where they hoped to be, nowhere close to what will eventually happen in after the 1950s and 60s. With all these changes that we've discussed, whether it be new roles for women in society, whether it be minorities more confidently articulating their perspective or advocating for civil liberties for themselves, whether it be things like birth control or more promiscuous youngsters, different types of music, new types of dancing. There's a lot of change happening very quickly. And so, like with any era of quick change, there's always a conservative opposition. And that's not just an American thing, that's a world history thing. Conservative opposition. There is a constant cycle of radical change and conservative backlash throughout human history. As more and more of the intellectual elite became pessimistic, secular, and socially radical, there developed more frustration from what sometimes gets called the moral majority, regular people who aren't necessarily gung-ho about changing things too quickly. Like I said, birth control, Darwinism, scientific breakthroughs, abstract art, which really annoys a lot of people, modernism, it's going to overwhelm a lot of people, most people. And there's also an active effort to update and modernize Protestant Christianity. So we're going to talk about that one. Now, most churches today accept or tolerate things that were considered against Christianity a few generations ago. One great example is like Elvis. Most church-going American people in their middle ages were uncomfortable at least with dancing by using the hips. And there were people who thought, and I know Elvis is at 1920's, this is the most obvious example in my mind. But there were people who believed that their religion told them that he was evil and like satanic, okay? That was not just a radical one person on Twitter type thing. That was, in society. Anyway, not for the younger generation, but for the parents. So what will develop is a movement called themselves Modernist Christians. And I'm going to give you a quote from a Modernist Christian so you can get their perspective. One Modernist Christian leader described his movement as, quote, the use of scientific, historical, and social methods in understanding and applying evangelical Christianity to the needs of a living person. And so what that means is basically trying to reprioritize Christianity. And that's so not like get rid of it or chop some pieces out, but, and again, this isn't just a Christian thing. Every religion, depending on what's going on with technology or the economy or society, religions tend to, like everything else, tends to bend to what's going on at the time. So you can have the same religion, even the same sect of a religion, and if you take a snapshot in one decade, what's normal and what's considered acceptable or unacceptable, and then you take it, 30, 40 years in either direction, take another snapshot, it's going to be very different. It's not because the Bible changes or the religion changes. It's because society is changing and people try to keep things relevant to what's going on in their face. Now, not everyone is okay with stuff like that. A lot of times people hear that and they'll say like, well, that seems a little bit, that might be problematic. That type of thing will outrage conservatives during this time. And here we see the rise of what was known as fundamentalism. Now, today the term fundamentalism is used to describe extremists or those popularly seen as like especially backwards members of all religions. But the term started as a specific movement in American Protestant Christianity, and that movement lives on to today. Certain dogmatic aspects of Christianity, like the virgin birth, creationism, details about the resurrection of Jesus, the nature of the Trinity, those types of dogmatic specifics, are going to lose their importance in many mainstream churches. And the focus changed to the broader concepts and the moral message. Again, I don't want to create a false dichotomy. It's not that those dogmatic things went away. Oh no, they weren't. They weren't ignored. They weren't hidden. They were still talked about. They were still believed in. When it comes to the emphasis of a sermon or the message, the outward message, it was usually more about God's love, God's grace, what would be considered at the time as positive, happy aspects, that those were emphasized more than before. But the fundamentalists, they argue for a strict, literal interpretation of the whole Bible to be seen as God's Word. So you would have some modernist Christians who would say, well, clearly science is telling us this one thing, and so, that doesn't mean that the Bible is wrong. It just means that parts of the Bible are written, maybe as an analogy, or, it's not to be taken literally. Whereas fundamentalists were no, it is to be taken literally. Once you say that one aspect of the Bible is not literal, then basically you're deciding what to believe in the Bible and what not to, and you're not supposed to do that, according to fundamentalists. And then, of course, the argument back against them was that, you can't even read the original language of the Bible anyway, which is Greek. So, of course, there's a lot of religious back and forth argument. So typically, whenever fundamentalists talked about the perfect Word of God being the Bible, they were talking about the King James Version of the Bible. Okay, I have another short section here, Happy Cities, Poor Farmers. So the 20s are known as the Roaring 20s, right? Lots of stuff going on. Well, the Roaring 20s meant success for most. It meant bad times for others. So farmers, they actually saw their incomes drop during the 20s. Now, the government took an active role by heavily regulating several industries that farmers relied on. This did not fix the problem. Farmers were becoming frustrated. The political leadership, which was Republican. So you're going to see a lot of farmers around the country become very loyal to Democrats, which will matter later in American politics. All right, so the twilight of prosperity. Now, 1929 started with extreme optimism. One thing I want to get out of the way here is there's a common perception that the reason that the stock market crashed was because the government stood idly by while greedy capitalists did whatever they wanted. And that the way to prevent the stock market crash and then depression, which happened after that, was for the government to have done more. Okay? That is a common perspective. However, it is not the total picture, and it's certainly not universally agreed upon. Whenever the Great Depression started, President Hoover did more to intervene in the economy than any other president other than Abraham Lincoln in American history. And it's important to keep that in mind, because the idea that Hoover was like a do-nothing president and he just wanted businesses to do whatever they wanted, and then FDR comes along and then invents all this new stuff to try to fix everything, that is not factual. You can have an opinion that Hoover didn't do enough, but there are no facts that support the conclusion that Hoover didn't do anything. Again, he did before FDR, and other than Lincoln, he did more than anyone else. Some people argue it made it worse, but anyway, we won't get too deep into that. Talk about the stock market crash. So the drastic rise in speculation. So everyone believed that the stock market could never fall again, like collapse again. A lot of people were buying stocks on debt, also known as buying on margin. These types of things, buying stocks on margin to the extent that it was done, made it more vulnerable to a shock. Buying on margin means you only pay down a certain amount, like 10%, for your stock. And then if the stock keeps growing and you're making payments, eventually you can own all of the stock that you've purchased outright, and it's never an issue. But if the stock market drops a certain amount, then you lose not only the 10% that you actually own, but now you owe for the rest of it. And you're in debt, and then with interest. So buying stocks on margin can serve as like a slingshot to make a drop of a certain amount actually much worse. All right, so let's talk about the crash. On Tuesday, October 29th, 1929, a massive sell-off started And then, of course, fear led to more fear. For those who purchased stocks on margin, it declined by only 10%, forced stockbrokers to sell the other 90% or risk going bankrupt. So many stocks bought on margin. Now, the crash did not cause the Great Depression. It contributed to it. The biggest reason the stock market contributed to the Depression is it shattered the optimism. It caused people to be less likely to spend and maybe want to save. It created a big hiccup. The stock market alone would not have led to a depression. It's much more complicated than, but it shattered the optimism. And so as capital was quickly taken out of the market, banks are going to dry up. When banks dried up, money available to companies dried up. Banks had to call their debts to companies who already had loans themselves. Companies couldn't afford to pay off their loans because consumption is dropping off now. That is, people buying things. And now the economy relied on consumption. When people stop spending, it could be a fatal blow. The economy relied on consumption, and that means that it's very vulnerable to consumer confidence. And so what happened was a cycle of bad things. Consumer confidence drops, people don't spend as much. People are in a lot of debt, banks have been sending out a lot of money, everybody's really leveraged. When people start saving money, banks tighten up, businesses can't get emergency money to compensate for people buying less of the product. Once that happens, businesses have to start laying off people, then unemployment goes up. Even less people have money to spend. Then banks become even more paranoid. Banks loan other banks money, and then some banks, there's no FDIC at the time, which means that if a bank goes under, people could lose their money. So people go to banks out of panic to get their money out. And like I said, it's a cycle. I can do another video specifically on the crash itself to get more details out, but I just want to give you an idea. When it comes to the government's role, this whole economic crisis, it's very controversial. Okay, like I said, the standard story is the government didn't really do anything, and it should have. And by doing nothing, that's what caused the crisis. There were very high tariffs on imports, and that's had dramatically cut down on international trade and investment, which decreased flexibility. I'll talk more about specifics in a later chapter. But for now, I just want to talk about the rest of the world in the Depression to sort of set the stage for the international situation we're going to cover later. Now, Europe had benefited tremendously from American loans after World War I. When the American economy collapsed, the loans dried up, and many European states experienced their own depression, especially Germany. And just when things started to look a little better in 1931, there was a massive bank failure in Austria, and that's going to cause a worldwide shock to investment confidence again. And so European banks pulled their resources out of American banks. In European countries, they're going to drop the gold standard to help their economies. Again, it's complicated. This is going to send the U.S. right back into depression.